Durban tomorrow, and this is attracting people from all over the world. So let's chat to somebody now who's there, Dr. Martyn Davies, who's been attending these kinds of fora, both here and also in Switzerland. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Davies. The theme, achieving inclusive growth through responsive and responsible leadership. I don't want to sound pessimistic, but this doesn't sound like an achievement. This sounds like something we ought to be doing anyway.
Well, Peter, thank you. It's a mission statement. Certainly, the World Economic Forum always comes up with these rather grand, themes for each summit. And this year's inclusive growth. It's a phrase used maybe arguably far too often these days, but perhaps with a little bit more substance to what it really means. But it's almost juxtaposed between the rhetoric we're hearing in our country currently around radical economic transformation. Does it equate to inclusive growth, or is it something entirely different? I think these are some of the topics we'll be discussing over the course next few days here in Durban, the WEF.
So, what can they discuss about this inclusive growth story? I mean, this is something that we've seen and experienced on the continent for decades. This isn't a new problem.
Certainly, there's no, how can we say, there's no policy silver bullet to suddenly drive inclusive growth. I think if we think a little bit more deeper about this, I think really what inclusive growth really is ultimately is to have a diversified economy that has a predominant and major manufacturing component to one's economy. We see this in Asia, economic history. We've seen that almost manufacturing diversification of the economy underpins firstly democracy or democratization of that country. Think post-industrial revolution, Western Europe, mid-19th century. Think Asia, led by Japan post-World War II, and more recently think China, the last 20, 25 years. As we have now a diversified economy, there's no sector like manufacturing that diffuses wealth through a society as well as manufacturing does. Results in relatively well-paid jobs, permanent employment, generates significant amounts of IP, intellectual property in that economy. And certainly we start off low. I mean, South Africa is quite different to many other economies in the region, of course. But how do you start to graduate from low-end, light industrial manufacturing, high employment generating, to more to higher tech, high value-add manufacturing? And for me, I think really the inclusive growth story, I think we're too often looking for short-term, particularly in South Africa currently, short-term policy solutions, state interventions, if you could say that, rather than a long-term, and manufacturing and diversification is really a generational play in the countries and regions I've mentioned, certainly testament to that. So what I'd like to see, particularly this week, is some more thoughtful, deeper conversation around what it really is inclusive growth, rather than just sort of a lip service to it. It sounds great, but it is far more difficult to sort of manufacture in reality or create in reality.
All right, so you've sort of hinted in terms of leading countries, and I'm just wondering if we have the leaders to be able to have that deeper conversation across the continent. You've travelled the continent quite a bit. Are we suggesting, by saying that through responsive and responsible leadership, that has this been lacking, or does it need to step up a gear?
Look, we're seeing, I think to make generic statements around Africa is somewhat sort of superficial, arguably. We live in a very heterogeneous, very complex continent, and we certainly see progressing states, developing states. We see failed states, and often the failures are due to failures in leadership. We have often predatory states. But are we seeing truly developmental states emerge? I mean, we had the last World Economic Forum in Kigali, Rwanda, this time last year. And the real take home from me is that under the leadership of Paul Kagame, Rwanda really is creating a developmental state in terms of economic terms. We say similar in Ethiopia's case, amongst others. So Botswana, Namibia, undoubtedly. And the question is really, what's the secret source of the political economy? How do we get the political economy working, i.e. states' relationship with capital and business, and what is the right balance between the two? Some states, arguably our own currently, adopt more of a statist approach, an intervention in the economy. We call it the developmental state, where others perhaps have a more approach to embracing and encouraging private capital, I think in the continent moving forward, as we're recovering, we're in this structural reform period post-commodity shock after July 2014, particularly on oil-propelled economies, think West Africa. We're starting to see the structural reform take place. I think Ghana, Exhibit A for me, Nigeria lagging somewhat, but slowly getting through it. South Africa, have we really selected a gear? But with the structural reform taking place, then we're going to start to see leaderships emerge, I think, hopefully, that are more economically savvy and understand that embracing private capital, it really is the real driver of growth rather than state intervention. And this has been, this is certainly what has underwritten the developmental success of Asia, being the best performing emerging region, a developing region in the course of the last generation or two. How do countries create, not so much do not intervene in their economies, but create those enabling environments for capital? That's most important.
All right. There's a couple of interesting sessions that are going to be coming through. Just before we came on air with you, we heard from business leadership in South Africa. PwC have come out with an interesting survey. How confident are CEOs about growth and business in Africa? And I suppose this speaks to their contribution to this whole inequality, inclusive growth drama. What's your experience? What's likely to come out of that survey, do you think?
Well, I think, confidence is the intangible driver of growth. And I think it's when you haven't got it. I think again, across the continent's a mixed bag. We have certain business communities which are incredibly confident about the future, in certain countries I've mentioned already, and others perhaps that are certainly far less confident. And what I hear in this town, in Durban, well, I think a lot of anticipation of what political leadership of our country will be saying this week in Durban. But from what I'm hearing, Johannesburg and Cape Town as well, the business centres of our country, confidence is not terribly high. And as I said, confidence really needs to underpin one's growth model. Ultimately, if domestic capital is not investing, how can we expect foreign capital to invest as well? I think that's sort of a key sort of observation and take home from myself. Right. From our perspective,
we're running out of time, but one very, very important question. One other session that's going to happen is a conversation, an interview, an insight with Malusi Gigaba. How important is this conversation going to be for the rest of Africa to get a sense of what Malusi Gigaba's role is going to be?
I'm attending a few sessions with our relatively new finance minister. And as you said, I think the phrase of inclusive growth will come up. The work we've done, certainly around financial inclusion, hopefully will feed into policy in terms of our Minister of Finance. But I think we have to adopt less rhetoric around radical and more rhetoric around what is achievable and what's pragmatic in the interest of all South Africans.
All right, Dr. Davies, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very much, as always, giving us time and your insights. Hopefully we'll get to chat to him a little bit more, Francis.